Now, with respect to sexuality, uh, Paul applies this argument in Romans 1:24 to 27, and he's about to explain how it is that by nature human beings are sexually perverted. Paul says, "Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves." That therefore points back to what he has just said in Romans 1:18 and following, that human beings, although they should be aware of God the Creator through looking at creation, instead became idolaters, and that turning away from God and turning towards what they themselves had created also meant that they turned away from how God created the world and began to abuse their bodies through homosexual relationships. Verse 25, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. There is some interesting and important terminology to note in this discussion. In Greek, the words kataphusin mean according to nature, and paraphusin means against nature. And this is the very language that we find Paul using in Romans 1 regarding homosexuality. The actions people have taken are actions that are against nature in lesbianism and male homosexuality. The language relates to this larger discussion about whether people do what they do because of nature or nurture. And the Roman sources also have the same phrasing, of course, in Latin. So, for example, Plato in Laws has an Athenian speaking in a discourse, and he says, and moreover, this institution, the gymnasium, when of old standing, is thought to have corrupted the pleasures of love, which are natural, not to men only, but also natural to beasts. For this your states are held primarily responsible, and along with them all others that especially encourage the gymnasia. This is an argument an Athenian is having with someone else, and the point being that the corruption has come from this institution of the gymnasium, and the corruption is really pederasty, homosexuality. And so it is not natural for men, and it is also obviously not natural for beasts. You don't see two male dogs partnering for life, but you find that animals in the animal world partner according to male and female. Plato continues with this Athenian speaking, and whether one makes the observation in earnest or in jest, one certainly should not fail to observe that when male unites with female for procreation, the pleasure experienced is held to be due to nature, kataphusin, but contrary to nature, paraphusin, when male mates with male or female with female, and that those first guilty of such enormities were impelled by their slavery to pleasure. Now, Musonius Rufus is a Roman philosopher, and he says in his work that he condemns sex outside marriage and not for procreation, such as adultery and sex of males with males, which he says is contrary to nature. And then Fuda Facilities reads, "Don't transgress the limits of sexual intercourse set by nature with unlawful love. Not even to animals themselves is intercourse between males pleasing." Also, in Aeschines, the speech against Timarchus, we read, "Or what man will not be regarded as lacking intelligence, who is angry with her who errs by an impulse of nature," that is adultery, while he treats as adviser the man who, in despite of nature, has sinned against his own body. And there that language of sinning against your own body is used with reference to going against nature, going against playing the role of a homosexual. Now, Paul uses that language of sinning against your own body in 1 Corinthians 6, incidentally, and he has in mind there sexual sin in general, not specifically, it appears, homosexuality. Plutarch, in Dialogue on Love, says, if union contrary to nature with males does not destroy or curtail a lover's tenderness, it stands to reason that the love between men and women, being natural, will be conducive to friendship developing in due course from favor. But the union with males, either unwillingly with force and plunder, or willingly with weakness, softness, malakia, and effeminacy, thelutes, surrendering themselves, as Plato says, to be mounted in the custom of four-footed animals and to be sowed with seed contrary to nature. This is an entirely ill-favored favor, shameful and contrary to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Now, Epictetus applies his argument about what is according to nature or against nature to sexuality. And the application has to do with homosexuality, because homosexuality is against nature. He says in Discourse 1:6, "And the existence of male and female, and the desire of each for conjunction, and the power of using the parts which are constructed, do not even these declare the workman?" So the Creator has established a certain use of the body parts, and that use would be a male and a female coming together, not a male and a male or a female and a female. Now, the next quote involves a word that we're not used to using in English, pathic. It comes from the word kineidos, and it is referring to the person who plays a male role in a homosexual relationship. So not the passive partner, but the active partner. And this is what he says in Discourse 2:10. "What does the pathic lose? He loses the man. What does he lose who makes the pathic what he is? Many other things. And he also loses the man no less than the other." And so we see here that Epictetus, like Paul, doesn't simply frown upon the male playing a passive role, as some have argued, but rather both are in a bad state. Both are going against nature. And so this is very similar to what we read in Romans 1. In fact, also in Romans 1, Paul talks about the parts, the use of the parts, in the same way that Epictetus does. Just to note, Paul is writing before Epictetus, but Epictetus represents Stoic philosophy that has been around for longer than Paul. And so the language is understandable within that philosophical system, if not beyond. Epictetus also says, "Are you man or woman? Man. Adorn yourself then as man, not as woman. Woman is naturally smooth and delicate, and if she has much hair on her body, she's a monster and is exhibited at Rome among monsters. And in a man it is monstrous not to have hair. And if he has no hair, he's a monster. But if he cuts off his hair and plucks them out, what shall we do with him? Where shall we exhibit him? And under what name shall we show him? I will exhibit to you a man who changes to be a woman rather than a man. What a terrible sight! There is no man who will not wonder at such a notice. Indeed, I think that the men who pluck out their hairs do what they do without knowing what they do. Man, what fault have you to find with your nature, that it made you a man? And that second last sentence brings in the idea of nature, acting against one's nature. And then he says, what paradox do we utter if we say that the evil in everything's that which is contrary to the nature of the thing? So in all of this, we see a very healthy discussion in the Greco-Roman world, and particularly in Stoicism, regarding what is natural. And that is something that is also applied to sexuality. This then is something that Paul is, Paul makes sense in Romans 1 in this regard, that he is not just parroting what the culture says at all, because most of the culture is in favor of some kind of pederasty and homosexuality, but he is nevertheless using the language and engaging the language of contrary to nature and sexuality in relation to that. Now, where Paul gets his thinking from is not at all the Greco-Roman philosophical world. It is something that we see from Judaism. And the next slide will give you some quotes in that regard. And that's an important point to make. Now, we also have some Jewish sources that go along the same lines. The Testament of Naphtali 3:3-4 says, having gone astray and forsaken the Lord, the Gentiles changed their order. But you shall not be so, my children, so that you will not become as Sodom, which changed the order of its nature. And Josephus, in Against Apion, a couple quotes. First, he says, what are our marriage laws? The law recognizes only sexual intercourse that is in accordance with nature, that with a woman, and that only for the procreation of children. And that would have to do with the proper place for sexual activity between a male and a female is within marriage. Then the second quote says, sexual intercourse with males which is contrary to nature and without restraint. Philo also speaks of pleasure contrary to nature, and in that he's commenting on the law against a male lying with another male as with a woman in Leviticus 20, verse 13. Before looking at the argument that covers the law that starts in chapter 2, verse 17, I want to draw some quick conclusions here about the human condition as it applies to nature and God's law. So first of all, Romans 1, verse 18 through 3:31 deals with the human condition in terms of sin. The issue is sin. And that's not the only place in Romans where that will be found. But the first argument has to do with sin so that the solution can properly be understood, which is a solution that begins in 3:21 with the righteousness of God through Jesus Christ, his blood shed for us as an atonement. Also, as in Greek and Roman philosophy, and especially Stoicism, living against nature is the problem. Paul will declare this to be sin. Homosexuality, thirdly, can be exemplified in Stoicism as living against nature, and also that is Paul's argument in Romans 1. Judaism also spoke about living against nature and spoke of homosexuality in this way. Paul, furthermore, saw idolatry and homosexuality as examples of living against creation. So we can talk about nature, we can talk about phusis, but we can also talk about God as creator, the one who has established nature the way it is. That natural argument is definitely a Jewish argument based right in the beginning of Genesis, but it is also an argument that we've seen in Stoicism. Furthermore, nature fails to lead to righteousness because of sin, Paul argues. Paul enters this discussion, this age-old discussion in Greco-Roman philosophy about the effects of nature and nurture on the human life, and he doesn't opt for one over the other, but simply says that both have failed. And so as we turn now to look at the law, we'll see that the same problem of sin applies to the law. The problem with the law is not firstly trying to establish one's own righteousness, so Luther, or putting up obstacles to Jewish and Gentile fellowship against the new perspective on Paul. Rather, the law is powerless to deal with the problem of sin.